Before we begin our story, let me explain some important Japanese cultural context. In Japan, many neighborhoods have local legends about specific places where accidents or supernatural events occurred. These places are often associated with curses or supernatural forces that bring misfortune to those who disturb them. Japanese school culture often involves group dynamics where popular students influence others to participate in daring activities. These group leaders are sometimes called gaki taisho, literally meaning child boss or kid leader. The number 17 in Japanese culture can have ominous associations, as it's sometimes connected with death and misfortune and folk beliefs. Now, let's begin our story. In my hometown there's a hill called 17 Hill. This hill has a dark reputation and is somewhat famous locally. According to legend, if a child falls on this hill, disaster will strike them when they turn 17 years old. When I was young, this hill was well known among the neighborhood children as one of our scariest stories. One day during elementary school, I was riding bicycles outside with my friend Michael and several other friends. After a while we encountered a group of troublemakers from our class. These were the tough kids, the ones who always acted like they owned the playground. When we talked to them, the tough group said they were heading to 17 Hill for a test of courage. Before we knew it, our group was dragged along with them. We formed a line of bicycles and rode together towards 17 Hill. Soon we arrived at 17 Hill. But as a test of courage, it wasn't very impressive. Apart from being somewhat steep, 17 Hill was just an ordinary short concrete slope, typical of those found in urban residential areas. It didn't look creepy, and the surrounding area wasn't unsettling either. Since it was bright daylight, just standing there wasn't much of a courage test, so the tough kids started showing off by deliberately letting go of their handlebars while riding down the slope, or standing on their pedals. They were trying to almost fall on this hill where you must never fall, competing to see who was bravest. Our group had no intention of participating in this test of courage. We just watched their circus performance from the top of the hill in amazement. Eventually one of the tough kids got annoyed with us just watching and shouted, "You guys do something too." Reluctantly I ended up participating in their circus as the representative of our group. I rode my bicycle down the hill trying to do small wheelies in the middle of the slope and weaving back and forth with one hand off the handlebars. But the tough group wasn't satisfied with my performance, even though they hadn't done anything spectacular themselves. They called me a wimp and coward, making fun of me. I became desperate and started riding down the hill with both hands off the handlebars, clack while I rode. Then I spread both arms wide and sang while going down the slope. I kept doing more and more dangerous things, one after another, trying to get laughs from the tough group. Eventually the whole scene turned into a circus show just for me. After several performances, while I was riding with both hands off the handlebars, singing and weaving down the hill, I finally lost my balance and crashed. I tumbled off my bicycle in the middle of the slope and hit the concrete ground with my hands and elbows, scraping my skin badly. The tough kids burst into laughter seeing me in pain. They said I was destined to meet my end at 17 and held their stomachs laughing. Several members of my group came down from the top of the hill on their bicycles to the middle of the slope where I was, worried about me. When the pain subsided a bit, I looked up toward the top of the hill. Michael, who was my closest friend, was the only one who hadn't come near me. He remained alone at the top of the hill, sitting on his bicycle, just standing there in a daze. When I wondered why Michael wasn't coming, another friend told me, "He's scared." Michael, who had always been somewhat timid, was afraid to ride his bicycle down the steep 17 Hill, so he just stayed there alone, motionless. My one-man circus show ended, and the tough group seemed satisfied. We decided to head home, partly to treat my injuries. I pushed my bicycle up the hill toward the top, where Michael was waiting. Then, when I was about 6 feet away from Michael, he suddenly shouted, "Whoa!" as if someone had pushed him from behind. Michael suddenly lunged forward on his bicycle, tumbling toward me. Michael rushed past me and went down to the middle of the hill, where he was thrown from his bicycle. He fell headfirst and smashed his face hard against the concrete. He hit his right forehead area severely, and scraped the entire right side of his face. Michael's face became covered in blood. When he lifted his face, he was in shock and couldn't make a sound. He just dripped blood steadily and endured the pain in silence. A neighborhood woman heard the impact sound when Michael fell and came over to us. She treated Michael's wounds and called an ambulance. Michael was taken to the hospital. The examination showed that Michael had no bone damage, but he had many scrapes on his face, elbows, knees, shoulders, and palms. Especially around his temple area, he had what doctors call a crushing wound, a large injury that would leave a permanent scar. Since Michael had no major physical problems, he returned to school 2 days later. However, the incident at 17 Hill must have been quite a shock to him. Even when spoken to, he remained silent, and it took a long time before he could have natural conversations again. I wanted to know what caused Michael to suddenly rush down from the top of the hill before he fell, so I asked him about it. Michael said someone had pushed him from behind while he was at the top of 17 Hill. At first, Michael felt someone's presence behind him, so when he tried to turn around to see who it was, he was suddenly pushed from behind with a strong force. When I was climbing the hill toward Michael, there was only Michael at the top of the hill. There wasn't a single person around who could have pushed him. But Michael wasn't the type to make things up or deceive people, so it didn't seem like he was lying. The cause remained unknown, leaving only an eerie impression that was vaguely carved into my memory along with the hill. Years later, Michael and I went to different middle schools, and weren't as close anymore. The incident at 17 Hill had been memorable for me at the time, but I gradually began to forget about it as time passed. I never even imagined that some disaster might befall Michael or me at 17 because we had fallen on 17 Hill. However, my thinking completely changed when Michael and I were 15, just after we entered high school. Although we didn't have many opportunities to meet during middle school, perhaps because we had become high school students, Michael and another friend visited my house when we were 15, probably thinking it was time to meet up after a long time. The moment I saw Michael, I was greatly surprised. For some reason during middle school, Michael had become somewhat popular in his class. He had undergone what we might call a middle school transformation, becoming more sophisticated and even a bit rebellious looking. But what surprised me wasn't that change. It was the dark mark on his face. He had a large reddish-black mark on his face, like a bruise that wouldn't heal. Centered around the temple area where Michael had hit 17 Hill that day, the crushing wound that had become a permanent scar, a circular mark about 2 inches in radius, had spread across the right side of his face. Until we graduated from elementary school, he hadn't had anything like that on his face. Even when I met him several times during middle school, there was no such mark. But as if he had suddenly been afflicted by something supernatural, such a mark had appeared in recent years. When I brought up the topic of the mark with Michael, surprisingly, he didn't seem to care much about it. He certainly didn't think it was some kind of curse. However, the area around his temple sometimes hurt, he said. Every time it hurt, he remembered the incident at 17 Hill, and had never forgotten it. The scar would suddenly start hurting without any warning. Because of this, Michael said he had sometimes lost his balance due to sudden pain while riding bicycles or other vehicles, putting himself in dangerous situations. He didn't believe it was the influence of a curse. But every time the scar hurt, he couldn't help but think about the disaster that was supposed to happen at 17. However, he was still only 15 at that time, not yet 17 when the disaster was supposed to occur. Even if some kind of supernatural force caused accidents through the pain in his scar, that was still 2 years away. But Michael jokingly said, "We really don't know what will happen in 2 years. And he added that when that time came, since I had also fallen, I wouldn't be safe either. We both laughed loudly together. The final meeting, I met Michael again, sometime later when he was 16. At 15, Michael had given the impression of a sophisticated rebel, even seeming somewhat bold. But when he visited my house at 16, He had completely changed from that time. He looked haggard and worn out, with a deeply troubled expression on his face. He said he might not live much longer and was extremely frightened. The mark on his face had grown even larger since he was 15, now covering about half his face. He said that after meeting me when he was 15, he had continued to experience dangerous situations due to the pain in his scar. At 16 he had gotten a moped license, but when he rode his moped, the pain in his scar would suddenly attack him at dangerous moments, as if something was trying to harm him. He said that when he was waiting on a station platform for a train, just as the train was approaching the platform, the pain in his scar suddenly struck, and he nearly fell onto the tracks. At that time I was confused by his frightened state and didn't know what words to offer him. Moreover, I couldn't accept the incredible story he was telling as the complete truth. Without being able to give him any decent advice, I reluctantly asked him to leave as he continued to express his fears. I heard news of Michael's passing about 2 weeks later. It was a single-vehicle traffic accident involving his moped. It was a tragically short life of only 16 years. I don't know if the pain in his scar influenced the accident, but one thing I can say is that he was 16 years old, not 17. It wasn't the disaster at 17 caused by 17 Hill, as the old legend claimed. The ritual. At Michael's funeral, elementary school friends gathered together for the first time in a long while. Naturally, the topic turned to the relationship between Michael's passing and 17 Hill. Someone suggested that we should all go to 17 Hill to perform a purification ritual, and we decided to gather the day after the funeral to head to 17 Hill. Since it was sudden and we had no connection to a spiritual medium, we just took some purifying salt and headed to 17 Hill the next day with several people for the ritual. However, I didn't participate in that ritual. I didn't want to go to 17 Hill, which held painful memories, and the ritual itself felt inappropriate given Michael's passing. While everyone was going to the ritual, I waited at home. After a while, the several people who had gone to the ritual came rushing to my house with pale faces. The ritual members were making a big fuss, saying 17 Hill is gone. According to them, no matter how much they searched, they couldn't find 17 Hill where it should have been. I hadn't walked to 17 Hill since elementary school, but I didn't remember any major construction that would have removed 17 Hill. I thought it must be some kind of mistake and calmed down the ritual members, sending them home. 20 years later, nearly 20 years have passed since then. Now in my mid-30s, I had been thinking about Michael frequently lately. According to legend, disaster should have struck at 17, but Michael had passed away at 16. I, who had also fallen on the hill, experienced no particular disaster at 17. Was there really no connection between Michael's passing and 17 Hill? I decided to verify this by visiting 17 Hill for the first time in decades. While walking from my house to 17 Hill, I was thinking about Michael. I wondered if there was something I had missed, some explanation for why the legend seemed both right and wrong at the same time. 17 Hill, which the ritual members had claimed was gone, naturally existed in its proper place. Perhaps because I had grown taller, the hill seemed a bit smaller, but the overall appearance of the hill was unchanged from long ago. I stood at the top of 17 Hill, in the same place where Michael had been sitting on his bicycle, and looked down the steep hill that Michael had been afraid to ride down. In the middle of the slope was the place where Michael and I had fallen. I was looking at the hill slowly, remembering those days. Then suddenly, I felt something like someone's gaze from behind me. When I turned around in surprise, no one was there. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was staring at me intently from a position below my eye level. It was as if a small child was standing right in front of me, looking up at my face. When I slowly lowered my gaze, there was still no one there. But by lowering my gaze, I felt for a moment as if I had made eye contact with someone. I felt like someone was looking into my face intently after making eye contact. I felt chills running through me and broke out in a cold sweat instantly. I remained frozen in place, unable to move due to panic and tension, and time just passed. Then suddenly, I stopped feeling the gaze I had been sensing, and the human presence in front of me disappeared. My tension gradually began to ease. Who had been standing in front of me? Was it the same presence that had pushed Michael back in elementary school? Even after my tension eased, I just stood there in a daze for a while. Eventually, I walked down the hill toward the bottom. I placed the bouquet I had bought to honor Michael by the side of the road, put my hands together, and prayed for Michael's peaceful rest. Then I looked up at this hill one more time, a hill I would probably never visit again. At the top of the hill, there was nothing. No one was there, but I still had the eerie feeling that someone was up there, looking down at me intently. When I stopped looking at the hill and turned around, I felt someone's strong gaze on my back, but I didn't turn around. I just silently started walking and left 17 Hill behind. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if the legend was true after all. Perhaps the hill claims its victims not exactly at 17, but when it chooses, and perhaps I was lucky enough to escape its grasp. Or perhaps, my time simply hasn't come yet.